Boxing.
Beats and rhymes.
Boxing.
Beats and rhymes.
The biggest week in boxing.
Tonight, history is to be made.
You had two heavyweights, two middleweights. We've never seen black athletes grabbing headlines like this. It was insane.
The Four Kings. Big fan of Nigel Benn. Big fan of Chris Eubank. But let's talk about the man they both avoided, Herol. Now, this Four Kings documentary is going to be very popular in the UK. It's going to be a lot of reminiscing. Good times. Bad times. Shortly before Chris Eubank took Nigel Benn's 160-pound WBO title in 1990, he sparred with Herol in Sheffield for 3 weeks, in which Eubank admitted he didn't hit the bomber until the final session they had. Eubank maintained when he became champion that he would never fight Herol as there was nothing intelligent about fighting a man you couldn't hit.
Benn, Watson, Steve Collins well, but Herol Graham was on the outside.
He was too good for his own good, really. I mean, he wasn't a man you could hit, and so if you had any type of reason or intellect at all, you'd say, well, why would I fight you? Why would you fight somebody you can't hit? And that's the greatest compliment I can actually pay you, Herol. Couldn't hit you. Not with a handful of stones, you couldn't be hit.
So would it be fair to say you avoided a fight with Bomber Graham?
I wouldn't actually say I avoided the fight. I categorically said on national television, I am not fighting you. Why would I fight someone I can't hit? That's not dodging. Dodging is when you make excuses, you know. A lot of people would say he wasn't in my class.
How bad were these beatings that Chris Eubank took from Herol? Then and even now, Nassim Hamid says, that was an embarrassment. You got picked apart every day. It was embarrassing and people used to look away. Now, Herol could do this in sparring sessions, in actual fights. The godfather of that Eubank style. Herol was labelled by Mickey Duff as the chairman of the Who Needs Him Club. Elusive and awkward, 160-pound southpaw with a 77-inch reach. I want to start the journey with his knockout defeat to Julian Jackson, as it's quite pivotal to tie the whole thing together. Graham was on his way to victory, ahead on all the scorecards. Julian Jackson's left eye was swelling up, on the verge of closing. Graham got uncharacteristically aggressive. It was sudden. That's the only description. It was sudden. The most sudden moment you will see in boxing, especially watching the fight live. It was just sudden. The fight was held in Spain, promoted by Barry Hearn. It was held in Spain because Jackson had a detached retina. The British Boxing Board of Control wouldn't license him. Julian Jackson, his account of the knockout was, just before he threw the punch, as he was being backed into the ropes, he turned southpaw and landed that right hand. That didn't travel very far.
Jackson, to his credit, sticking to his task, as desperate as it is.
But falling ever further behind them. Oh no! That's what we were worried about. He won't get up from that.
He's at
a right hand.
Commentary courtesy of Jim McDonald and Dave Brennan. Pro Box. As you hear Dave Brennan say, oh no, you hear that thudding sound. That's Herol's head smashing against the canvas. The back of his head. I remember the shot. It was the opposite hand because I was facing him, and I could see his glove coming over, and I'm walking over to him as to say, yeah, I'm going to get there before you. And it wasn't like that. He got me. I didn't even flinch, point blank. Graham says I was throwing an overhand right, and he threw a bomb, and it landed on here. The punch executed by the lethal middleweight Julian Jackson saw Graham's body sway, and then, with his lights turned out, plummeted back towards the canvas, hard. There were more bouts for Graham, more years of boxing, training, camps, sparring, fighting. There were victories and defeats, though nothing as epic as the thunderous Jackson blow that set in motion a chain of events that had resulted in Graham and the author meeting in the psychiatric ward of a North London hospital. In a grim place, the summer sun shines, birds sing and pigeons occasionally stop by a picnic table that has been bolted into the astroturf. But even they don't stay for too long. There is nothing to enjoy in the bleak surroundings, in the outward yard of the ward. Empty shells of men who were trapped by the high walls for their safety, and everyone else roams. One murmurs to himself in the corner, facing the brickwork. Another in his 30s, and who could easily appear on the cover of GQ. Patrols the small area, completing laps with a false confidence as if he's setting off on a mission. Another barks abruptly in an Eastern European accent. One resident sits alone in a trance. He's almost unnerving. It looks like Graham doesn't belong here. He's different, and not just because he's challenged for a world title on 3 different occasions. He's like me. He greets me with a smile, asking me about my trip, escorts me outside to give us the best chance of being left alone. He looks around at some forlorn faces. I hope they don't go before me, he laughs, as if to say he must be in a bad way if they're released ahead of him. That one, he adds, subtly raising his finger. I feel for him. He can't communicate with anyone. He doesn't know what he's doing. Graham is suffering from short-term memory. He said he can't remember things from years ago. He's trying to conjure images, clues, anything he can use to lever out information. Yesterday, I'm trying to think now, it's from the McCallum fight. Then he says, not the McCallum fight. He searches briefly for names. The Jackson fight, especially, I mean. The shot he hit me with. I was out before I touched the floor. That was it. That was the beginning and the end of it, if you know what I mean. They sit side beside each other on the bench. Chris Dixon says that Herol still looks muscular. None of the guys in the ward would want to go a couple of rounds with him, that's for certain. He arrives at the Jackson knockout swiftly and unprompted. Everything changed from that one punch. Graham has a habit of saying, "You what?" when he emphatically agrees with something. He asks the author, can he retrieve the fight on his phone, and within seconds they're watching the fateful 4th round. When the punch lands, he sighs loudly. The air leaves him. That's what we were worried about, screams Screen Sport commentator Dave Bremner. But I was still breathing anyway, Graham whispers, as though it was a moral victory. Did you feel it? Asks the author. Did you feel the punch? He laughs uneasily. I assume the punch could have been so hard and knocked him so stiff and so cold that it immediately had switched off any feelings. He says, "Come here, let me try it on you," he chuckles. It hit the side of my face. I felt numbness and I remember falling. I could feel myself going down. Then blackness. The next thing Graham remembers is being in the hospital after that. He watched it on television and it was then it really sunk in. Watching it, I felt that punch. He says, "Shit, if I did what I was supposed to have done, which is run away, but I went to him. And when you're going into a person, the shot is twice as hard. Normally, I'd back off, and back off." One may argue that the accumulation of punches that Herol Graham took for his career correlate to the issues that he's went through post-boxing career. But Herol believes the Julian Jackson fight is responsible for his current distable disposition and depression. It's because of trauma to my brain, he explains. They said I got hit and all the blood vessels have exploded and all that type of stuff. Since then I've been in a depression. It's going to make me cry. The tears suddenly stream down his cheeks. He hides his face in his hands. Oh shit. Comes from behind a guard. He's hurt. He's embarrassed. He's alone. He indicates that he needs some time by raising his right hand. I place mine on his shoulder to comfort him. You see, that's how bad it is, he continues. It's from boxing, definitely. I didn't get punched as much as a lot of them, but it's enough in the sense it's hurt me, and I've got brain damage. You do get punch drunk. It does that to you. When Sugar Ray Leonard upset Hagler in 1987 via split decision, Leonard had been out of the ring for nearly 3 years. The IBF, they declined on sanctioning the bout. America's light middle gold medalist Frank Tate from the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics fought the Canadian Michael Olajide for the vacant strap that year, flooring Olajide twice en route to a very impressive 15-round victory. Leonard versus Hagler was scheduled for 12. Hagler could have put in a request to get the fight over 15, but he decided not to. Probably a mistake, along with starting out the fight in orthodox, another mistake. Just wasn't Marvin's night. When he lost, the WBC gave him a little while to decide what he was going to do, but he never came back. Leonard was stripped because he wouldn't defend against Herol Graham. The WBA wouldn't sanction Leonard versus Hagler because Herol Graham was the mandatory to face Hagler for that particular organization. Herol Graham was supposed to face Iran Barkley for the vacant WBA title. Barkley got cut, fight was postponed, it fell through, and Herol Graham fought Colombe and lost his unbeaten record in 1987 for the European title. Colombe hurt Herol late on in the fight, took a unanimous decision, very close on all the scorecards, very close. And Colombe went on to fight for the vacant title against Barkley, winning a UD in Italy. Graham was 38-0 when he lost for the first time against Colombe. But with a world title shot guaranteed, looking back at it in hindsight, Team Graham needed to take a stay busy fight, so to speak. But that's not what Graham did. Moves up to 160. Tony Simpson has the big domestic clash against Mark Kaler. All the straps are on the line. British, Commonwealth, and European. Simpson, or Sibbo, as he was known to his fan base, wins the fight. With Herol Graham breathing down his neck, he vacates the British title. Why? He didn't have a world title shot in the offering or anything. He just vacated the title. And Graham had to pick up the vacant title from the Liverpudlian, Jimmy Price, who he stopped in around. Hey, I like Tony Simpson. Looks like a bit of a duck to me, though.
Simpson hit the roof after those jibes by Bomber Graham, literally and figuratively. Helping his brother-in-law on the building site enabled him to work off some of the fury he felt at being pushed into a defence against a man he doesn't think deserves a crack at the British title.
I've only just won the British title, and they know I've got to defend the European title at the end of February. So what chance? Marvin Hagler can't even defend both world title fights in a month. So what chance have I got of doing a British title? There's no chance.
So you don't think you want to fight Herol, certainly?
Oh no, there's no problem in fighting Herol Graham. I mean, if he can, I don't think he can sell enough tickets to fill his front room. But that's his problem. That's not mine. He's good at talking, but the thing is, the fighting's not his department. He can talk, but he can't fight. He really has never fought anybody of any world class. You know, he was European and British champion as light middleweight and got out of that division before it got too dangerous. So I feel now he's trying to manipulate me as a meal ticket. You know, like he's going to try and manoeuvre me into a fight with him for a meal ticket for him. You know, I'm going to benefit. I'm not going to benefit from it. It's his pocket what will benefit from it.
You must have seen all the stuff in the papers today, Herol, saying you're running scared. You don't want to meet him because you could lose everything.
I'm not worried. I just wish I'd have been there Friday night on your show. I could have strangled him there and then, because that's how I feel. He's just a parasite. I'm not interested in the man at all.
Sorry to all the people of Leicester. Tony Simpson is a legend, but he blatantly ducked Herol Graham. He vacated the British title and didn't fight for the whole of 1985. Came back in 86, had 3 fights, not against anyone of note. Lost a light heavyweight title attempt against Dennis Andrews for the WBC belt. And then he fought Brian Anderson, Herol Graham's stablemate from the Eubank gym. Only not as talented as Herol, an honest pro, strong, fit, good enough to become British champion. After Herol Graham vacates, and Simpson rolled him over pretty easy. Now Brian is not as popular as Herol Graham, but Simpson wasn't worried about how much tickets that Brian sold. But with Herol, he was worried about the gate. So after Herol picked up that title that Simpson vacated, Herol Graham stops Mark Kaler in 8 rounds. Kaler previously had a very competitive fight with Tony Simpson, losing a 12-round decision. So when people say Eubank wouldn't fight him and Benn wouldn't fight him, Tony Simpson wouldn't fight him. And he was one of the biggest names in the game in the UK. So he didn't get opportunities against Hagler when he was Hagler's mandatory. By this time, Herol Graham was the mandatory for the WBA and WBC. Ray dropped the WBC title rather than fight Herol Graham at 160. I mean, Herol Graham was approaching 30. His record was 41-1-0 when he got his second world title shot against Mike McCallum. Split decision loss, Royal Albert Hall. He turned pro in 1979. He had already fought 3 15-rounders early in his career for British and Commonwealth. He had already been 154-pound European, British and Commonwealth champion, 160-pound British and European champion. He had beat Lindell Holmes, future world champion. He beat Sanderline Williams on points, who has a draw with James Toney, and took Nigel Benn to a split decision. He ended Ayab Kalouli's career. Frank Warren's boy, Jimmy Price, unbeaten. They tried to see if he could beat Herol for that vacant British title. Got knocked out in a round. Cartel fighters like Mark Kaler, when they did press their luck and not avoid Herol Graham, got stopped. Rod Douglas, unbeaten. He was a big deal in the UK. He won the ABA titles, or how much times? About 4 times. Beat Nigel Benn as an amateur. Lost to Nigel Benn as an amateur. He was a big deal with that Mohican haircut from East London. Proper hard nut. Herol stopped him in 9. He never fought again. Brain injuries. But he recovered well, thankfully. James Cook, assistant trainer to Anthony Yard. It's a difficult fight. Herol made it look easy. Sparring session. James Cook was a European super middleweight champion. James put an L, the first L of Michael Watson's career, early in his career. Herol Graham, man, no joke. By 93, Herol Graham, 33 years of age, lost the rematch to Colombe, and then he lost for the first time to domestic opposition Frank Grant, a decent fighter, but not world class. He was stopped by Frank Grant. Now maybe all the tough battles had caught up with him. When he lost to Frank Grant, 92, I thought it was over. He was out the ring for 4 years. He tried to come back 2 years previously, 94, but the board wouldn't license him. Apparently he passed a neurological test, but they had doubts that he was fit enough to fight. It does make you wonder why the board wouldn't license him 2 years previously, but decide to license him when he's 2 years older. Had a couple of 8-rounders, and then he defeated the 18-0 Canadian prospect, and he was a hot prospect at the time, Chris Johnson. Then he beat Vinny Pazienza on points. And his last fight was for the IBF super middleweight title against Charles Brewer. It looked like Herol had finally won the world title. Had Brewer down twice. But Brewer, he rallied and stopped Herol on the 10th. Man, oh man, oh man. That was his last fight.
Is it one gamble too many against Charlie the Hatchet Brewer, a taller, heavier and younger opponent? What would it take to make Graham quit the sport?
When I get hurt, properly hurt, I'm finished. I keep saying to Glenn, and win the championship, defend it 3 times, and I can get out of the game. Because it is a hard sport.
How was Herol Graham avoided in that boom period for British boxing with the middleweights and super middleweights? It started in 1989. Finsbury Park, North London. Michael Watson took Nigel Benn's Commonwealth title. 6-round TKO. Took Nigel's unbeaten record. 1990. Eubank took Nigel Benn's WBO title, which he won from Doug DeWitt in America, in Birmingham. Classic fight. TKO in the 9th. June 1991. Chris Eubank defends his 160-pound WBO title against Michael Watson at Earl's Court and gets a controversial majority decision. In the rematch in October of that year, Eubank wins by 12-round TKO. This is at super middle for the vacant WBO title. All the way through to October 1993, when Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn attempt to unify their titles at 168 in a big event at Old Trafford. The fight ends in a draw. A bit anticlimactic considering the huge build-up for one of the most anticipated fights I've seen in British boxing. Let's keep it real. Michael Watson, he didn't want no part of Herol Graham either. You know, the likes of Eubank and Benn, even without their rivalry, you have a feeling they would have been somewhat of a curiosity. You know, Eubank, the monocle, the Joffers, and the exaggerated aristocratic musings. Benn went for the knockout, hit tremendously hard. But Michael Watson doesn't become a big star in the UK without them two. But at the same time, he just seemed to complement their more out there personalities, although Chris and Nigel are totally different. His fight with Nigel Benn for the Commonwealth title got a lot of mileage in the British press. Michael went unbeaten. He lost the early points decision to James Cook. His breakthrough fight was when he stopped dangerous Don Lee at the Grand Hall, Wembley. The fight was stopped in the 5th when the inside of Don Lee's mouth was cut really bad. Don Lee was a tall, erratic if you like, big punching middleweight from America who stopped Tony Simpson in what was a big upset. But Michael boxed a nice, composed fight, ran up several more wins, mostly stoppages, before the big showdown in the tent at Finsbury Park against Nigel Benn. This was just for the Commonwealth title, but it was just a buzz about these fights. There was just a buzz.
We'd never seen black athletes grabbing headlines like this. It was insane.
Watson, Benn, Eubank, all of a sudden became household names. Press couldn't get enough of them. Public couldn't get enough of them. Unfortunately, Herol Graham was still locked out. Then you got the curious case of the WBO. American middleweight Doug DeWitt seemed to have found his limit when he lost wide decisions, although always putting up a battle against the likes of Milton McCrory, Thomas Hearns. You could see how much punches Doug took by the flatness of his nose, which he said when he retires he's going to get it surgically repaired. Then he challenged Sumbu Kalambe for the WBA belt. On the back of getting knocked out by Kalambe, Doug DeWitt, he got a shot at the inaugural WBO 160-pound title against Robbie Sims. He avenged his earlier loss to Sims on points to claim the title. Now, I remember one quote he said. He always thought the WBO belt was a load of BS, but when he won it, it was the best thing in the world. He defended against Matthew Hilton, and then on a top-ranked card in Atlantic City, Nigel Benn went over there and got off the canvas, 3 knockdown rule, 8th round knockout, and became champion, stopping DeWitt, taking DeWitt's belt. Nigel wasn't finished there. He went back to America, had a war with Iran Barkley, 3 knockdown rule again, and successfully defended his belt. The controversy whether Benn hit Barkley while he was down or if Barkley could have continued after the 3 knockdowns brought the end to the 3 knockdown rule in America after that fight. I don't think the public cared about the legitimacy of the belt. I think they cared about the fights, the characters, the fighters. I mean, the fights played out like pantomime, even when there was just a Commonwealth belt at stake for Benn and Watson. I mean, Nigel Benn, his ring entrance, he came into Conroy Smith's and he was skanking on his way to the ring. That was some entrance. Benn fought a reckless fight in the tent in Finsbury Park. They erected a tent in the park for the fight. And Michael stayed tight, covered up, blocked a lot of the shots, used his jab on occasion, and was waiting for Nigel to burn himself out, which inevitably in the 6th round he did. People say, oh, he went down from a jab. No, he didn't go down from a jab. He went down from a 3-piece combination, right, left, right, then jab. The crowd roared with excitement. Massive win. Huge win. Michael Watson is that dude now. There was high hopes for the new boy on the block, Michael Watson, fresh off the stoppage of Nigel Benn, age 25, that he could displace the 34-year-old veteran champion who had already been a light middleweight champion, Mike McCallum, 34 years of age. Mike McCallum, the veteran Jamaican road warrior, he won that WBA 160-pound title at the Royal Albert Hall in '89, split decision. He defended it in Boston against Steve Collins, the unbeaten 16-0. Steve gave him a very tough fight and lost the UD. A couple of months later, Mike made his way back to the UK. That's how they did it back then. Steve Collins in February of 1990, and then Michael Watson in May of 1990. Michael puts up a great challenge. He gives it his all. But McCallum worked Michael over pretty bad. McCallum gave Michael a good working over. McCallum can do it all. He's not the hardest puncher. He's not the fastest. He's not the most intimidating. But there's nothing he actually can't do in the ring. Slip, he can block, he can parry. His punches flow effortlessly. Very difficult to fight. And they should have pulled Watson out. In the 11th, you have to say that Jimmy Tibbs and Mickey Duff let it go on too long before Watson was knocked out. That type of beating, you have to wonder what kind of impact it can have on the rest of your career. Eubank turned pro in '85. His first few fights were in New York. In 1989, Chris fought a total of 9 times. And then in the year he challenged Nigel Benn for the WBO belt, he fought 5 times, including the Benn fight. So he stayed extremely busy against a mixed bag of opponents, like Frankie Morrow was durable. Anthony Logan, who we outpointed, nearly knocked Nigel Benn out in an absolute wild slugfest that you might want to watch. He outpointed journeymen like Randy Smith, an elite journeyman. And there's a few cans in there, you know what I'm saying? There's a few cans. Contreras took him the distance. Hugo Corti, the Argentinian, he was pretty tough. The Welshman Dennis Cronin, Chris used him as a punch bag. Cronin was built like a brick crap house. Very strong. You know, the Kid Milo fight was pretty tough. Like, Chris hurt Milo. Milo, looking helpless on the ropes, was ready to go. And Chris just backed off. For what reason, I don't know. The fight was stopped in the 8th because of a cut on Milo's eye. The De Santos knockout, I think most people remember that. And then he posed to the camera. Fritz Nassim was in the crowd. And then the Nigel Benn fight came. And by this time, like, because he was so active, he had built up quite a profile. And he continued this into his championship reign, just fighting all the time. There just seemed to be a Chris Eubank fight on. And this made him ubiquitous with the British public, as well as his eccentric fighting style and eccentric outside the ring persona. Nigel Benn, after the loss to Watson, he regathered himself, he trained in America and was promoted by Bob Arum, where he had 5 fights consecutively. He fought tough Jorge Amparo, tough 10-rounder, then knocked out Jose Quinones in the first really good knockout. Then he got Sanderline Williams, split decision, tough fight, got hurt. This is someone who Herol Graham UD'd. Bob Arum used to call Nigel Benn his British haggler. His fights were promoted by Arum over there. After that, he had the 2 fights with Doug DeWitt and Iran Barkley. 5 fights in America on the bounce. All wins. All wins.
On that particular night in question, I will show that I have what it takes. This man is nothing but, he's the real hype. I come up the hard way. I didn't have Frank Warren. Myself, boy. You had your time. Let's have some parliamentary procedure here, all right?
Oh, God.
I pray that I have enough dignity not to hate the man.
Exactly.
Hate doesn't come into it for me. Hate destroys the game and makes it look brutal, and that's why a lot of people don't take to it. I don't hate the man. I want the man's title, and I intend to prove that I'm a better fighter than the man, which I am.
All right, gentlemen, you both signed the contract.
I personally do hate him.
So is there any point in me asking you to shake hands after signing the contract?
No.
Eubank got off to a great start, hurting Nigel with a left hook in the second. Nigel got through with some big uppercuts that you could see visibly made Chris try to feel if his tongue was still attached to his mouth. He bit into his tongue. Nigel's body shots were threatening to fold Chris in half at stages. The overhand right that floored Chris in the 8th, he said it was a slip. Nigel's eye was swelling up really badly though, practically shut. And when Chris landed that overhand right, Nigel couldn't see it. He followed up and Richard Steele saved Nigel. Chris took the title. But Chris, the enigma that he is capable of moments of brilliance in the ring and mediocrity. First defense is against the spoiler from Canada, Dan Sherry, which ends in a technical decision win when Sherry makes a meal of it on the canvas after spinning Chris numerous times and ending up behind him. Chris flicks his head back. It doesn't look like a serious crime. Is Sherry trying to win the fight on the canvas, trying to get Chris disqualified? It goes to a technical decision. Chris keeps his belt. It's a disappointing evening. And then the Gary Stretch fight. Gary Stretch, who made his name by snapping George Collins' long undefeated run as an amateur. He's now 22-1-0. 1 cut eye stoppage loss. That was earlier. He's challenging Eubank. Now Stretch, like, bit of a playboy, apparently, a model. There's banter between Stretch and Eubank. The press and their ways. They titled the fight Beauty and the Best. Reg Guttridge. What did he say? He made a play on it, like he was great with wordplay. He called it Beauty and the Boast because of Eubank and his arrogant, I guess, demeanour. And Stretch, a tall southpaw, he was ahead on the scorecards according to the 3 judges. In the earlier rounds, he was a little quicker than Chris, longer reach, he was leading off. The London crowd cheering on his efforts made him get a little too ambitious, knowing that Chris can turn a fight around with 1 punch. Chris was lunging in quite a bit and he had success. He wasn't looking spectacular. In the 5th, he shook Stretch up. In the 6th round, Chris ducked low from a Stretch attack and Stretch followed up by leaning on top of Chris's back and pushing him down into the canvas. You could see Chris weren't happy about it, and he seemed to liven up. Shortly after that, he landed a right hand down the pipe. Stretch was shook up. Chris followed up. Down he went. Stretch got back up. Overhand right. Knocked him through the ropes. Job done. I think the crowd was pro Stretch. You know what I mean? I think they were a little disappointed. In all fairness to Chris, despite him saying categorically he wouldn't fight Herol Graham, when Herol was challenging for that vacant WBC belt against Julian Jackson in Spain, 6 days after Chris beat Nigel Benn for that WBO belt, he said if Herol Graham wins that fight, he will be looking to unify with him. He did say that on camera. Unfortunately, Herol got touched on the chin by Julian Jackson, and that kind of derailed his involvement in the domestic middleweight, super middleweight matchups with Benn, Eubank and Watson. That put a bit of a spanner in the works. Although post-fight Chris Eubank, Gary Stretch, I see Brendan Ingle in the ring, and he's obviously looking to make some noise about Eubank fighting Herol Graham, although if Herol Graham had beat Julian Jackson, the pressure would have been on Chris Eubank and on Nigel Benn as well to take this fight.
But he beat a great deal of good fighters over the years. Ayab Kalula for one.
Well, he wiped out all the domestic fighters, didn't he?
Yes.
And most of the modern ones, like Nigel Benn, Michael Watson and Chris Eubank, didn't want to fight him.
Exactly, and who can blame them?
The legendary dynamic duo partnership of Herol Graham and Brendan Ingle wasn't all smooth sailing. When Hall of Fame boxing promoter Barney Eastwood came on board, there was tension between Brendan and Barney, and that seemed to spill out into Brendan's relationship with Herol Graham. There's a couple of times Brendan left and came back. In the Mike McCallum fight, there seemed to be miscommunication between Herol and Brendan. Is that a contributory factor? The difference between winning and losing? Or are we just crying over spilt milk? Some people are critical of Brendan Ingle's body sparring, no headshots. Tony Bellew, he questioned the policy and method of just body sparring at the Winkerbank gym after Kid Galahad was relieved of his IBF featherweight title by Kiko Martinez in a massive upset in a fight that Kid Galahad was dominating. Sometimes it's just not meant to be.
Herol Graham is one of the most extraordinary boxers Britain has produced. Although he's been known as Bomber throughout his career, perhaps his other nickname, the Showman, is more appropriate. Blessed with a style all his own, a style that influenced a generation of fighters in Brendan Ingle's small gym in Sheffield.
I met him when we were both amateur boxers down at Brendan Ingle's some 20 odd years ago. I think it was about 1975, 1976. Herol won everything in the amateurs then. And, you know, I want everybody at the time, and even now, you know, they still got the Herol Graham style of boxing. I was one of them. A lot of people are saying that it's Brendan Ingle's style of fighting. Me personally, I think it's the Herol Graham style of fighting, because before Herol Graham, you know, fighters in Sheffield were boxing the normal way of fighting. And Herol Graham comes along, and everybody, myself included, starts his hands down, elusive style. And fighters are still doing it coming out of Sheffield.
For most of the decade, it seemed that even the American giants of the middleweight division were running scared of him. Emmanuel Stewart, now a member of the Lennox Lewis team, with whom Graham's been working in the build-up to his challenge for Charles Brewer's world super middleweight title, had an impressive stable of fighters when Bomber was at his peak.
I know myself, I never would fight Herol Graham with any of my fighters coming up, and I had quite a few middleweight, junior middleweights, and middleweight champions. He was the one guy that I always was afraid of because of his boxing talent and his left-handed style. So I think probably many other managers felt the same as I did.
It was a style that influenced one young man in particular, filmed as a 10-year-old, emulating his hero.
Herol was champion at the time when I was a kid, and I was winning national titles while Herol was defending his British, his European, and boxing for world. And I used to look at Herol and think, I'm going to be as good as that one day, or even better, and win world titles. And Herol was a great influence at the time.
How do you think you would have fared if you'd have fought Chris Eubank or you'd have fought Nigel Benn? Fighting Chris Eubank or Nigel Benn at the time, I would have done the same what I did with them. He put me down on one occasion. After that, he never touched me. He had to go home. He begged to go home at weekends because he was that peed off with me. He went home and came back on the Monday Just continued the sparring. He hated me that much, sort of thing. That's what happened. It's just fun. He's just sparring with me. Either one of them, they wouldn't box me. Chris Eubanks promised never to fight me, and he kept his word.
Why did he promise? Because of the fear of what you do to him?
Yeah, because of what I did with him when they were sparring with him down at Brendan. I was battering him. He hated every second, every minute of it. And Brendan just said, come on, carry on, carry on. And like, I had loads of respect for him still. I was sort of taking it easy, to tell the truth. And Brendan said, come on, pick it up, you need to pick it up. He's not paying you, you're paying him.
What do you think you would have done with Nigel Benn?
Nigel Benn.
Because that's the biggest debate. It was on the website and everything.
Yeah, Nigel Benn knows full well that if I boxed him, I'd have done the same with him that I did with Chris Eubanks. I mean, I used to have heavyweights come in, light heavyweights, and did the same with them. This is not me being big-headed. I just did it. It's like saying either me or them. And I didn't know where it's going to be me. It's just the movement. And he was definitely not used to my movement at all. And that's why I never did want to fight me. He would have got the same treatment as everybody else, really.
Herol Graham, he may feel hard done by talking about his boxing career, but Mike McCallum, the Jamaican, who Graham lost a split decision against in London, Royal Albert Hall, on a cartel run promotion, vacant WBA title on the line, pitted two avoided fighters going against each other. Mike McCallum is a freeweight world champion, and he was avoided just as much as Herol Graham. What stood out for me, what he did so well, which other opponents couldn't do with Herol Graham, is when Graham would spin him and push him off, he didn't get frustrated. So even though he looked a bit more awkward in this fight than others, he stuck with it, manfully and skillfully. Graham, he used the ring very well, that southpaw stance and that long reach. Very awkward fight for McCallum. I don't know if that fight was boring to some. I actually thought it was a very good fight. Graham wasn't boring. He threw a lot of punches. He just made it miserable for his opponents while they was in there. It was a mentally tough fight as much as a physically tough battle. McCallum just had a little bit more know-how on inside fighting. One of the few fighters who could catch Graham as he pulled out with his hands down in straight lines. And his all-round boxing IQ was just a little too much for Graham, but it was a split decision. You see Graham's eyes looking all puffy after? You rarely saw that. Championship rounds were a dour struggle. Like McCallum was struggling. Definitely struggling with Graham's reach and footwork. These are the guys that Herol Graham had to fight for world titles. An ATG in Mike McCallum, one of the best boxers ever. And one of the hardest punchers ever in Julian Jackson. He didn't have the luxury of fighting for the WBO title like Benn, Watson and Eubank.